So for everyone out there, it's a pleasure to meet you. My name is Kate Melchior. I'm one of the coordinators from Massachusetts. Should we all just introduce ourselves really quickly?
Sure.
All right, I'll toss it to you, John.
My name is John Taylor, and I'm the coordinator for National History Day in Maine. Samantha or Alyssa?
Hello, I'm Sam. I'm the Rhode Island History Day coordinator.
Hi everyone, I'm Alyssa Tardif. Along with Kate, I am the co-coordinator for Massachusetts, and we both work at the Massachusetts Historical Society.
Okay. Do you want to go over any protocols?
Yeah, so before we introduce our wonderful presenter for today, I'm sure most of you have been living on Zoom, whether you like it or not, for the last few months. But just in case anyone's not familiar with how webinar works specifically, it's a little different from the regular Zoom call. So if you take a look, you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen a whole bunch of different tabs and boxes. There's one of them that says Q&A. It has two little speech bubbles. And at any time during the presentation, if you have a question for the presenter, feel free to pop it into the Q&A box, and we will bring it up either if it's kind of appropriate at the moment for the presenter or at the end of the presentation so she can get back to you. And the other significant box down at the bottom is the chat box. And you guys are welcome to kind of bring in observations or kind of chat back and forth there as well. And that you can also use during the presentation. So we're planning on having Ms. Bishop present her materials and then having a chance for everybody to ask questions at the end, and we hope that you will take part. If anyone has any questions as well, one other note, so you can see in the chat, make sure if you want to send it to everybody, if it's a message for everyone, that you select the option in the chat to send to all panelists and attendees, or if you have a logistical question or something and you just want to direct it to one of the panelists, feel free to do that as well. I think that's it. Anything else? All right, well, on that note, I'm going to turn my screen off and turn this over to John so that he can introduce Libby.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us for our afternoon session. I promise you will not be disappointed. I have seen Dr. Bischof speak on numerous occasions, and I always come away learning something new or interesting. Dr. Libby Bischof is a 19th century American cultural historian specializing in the history of photography and with a particular focus on Maine. She is the co-author of the 2015 book, Maine Photography, A History, 1840 to 2015. And in 2011, she co-curated an exhibition, Maine Moderns, Art in Sycuanland, 1900 to 1940, at the Portland Museum of Art with the senior curator, Susan Danley. The show won the Critics' Choice Award for Best Historic Show in the 2011 New England Art Awards. Her other research interests include Maine history and 19th century New England women writers as well. So as a side note, I really want to point out two really cool projects she's worked on in the past few years. And one of them is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Libby, documenting all the World War I monuments throughout the state of Maine. And also, you're currently collecting photos of signs and sidewalk art and that type of stuff throughout Maine that's connected to COVID-19 and our current state of affairs.
Correct.
Yes. So Libby is also a postcard nerd, according to her bio online as well. And I would be remiss if I did not tell you to follow her in her postcard adventures on Instagram at the Maine Postcard Project. Aside from teaching many college courses and working on various historical organizations, Libby is the executive director of the Osher Map Library and Smith Center for Cartographic Education at the University of Southern Maine. She enjoys working with K through 12 educators and students, has always been a strong advocate for NHD in Maine. I can't thank her enough for everything she's done for us. Libby continuously makes time to do things all the time for our program. So today she'll be talking about storytelling using visual sources and basics of exhibit design. And with that, I'll just turn it over to you, Libby.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody. I'm about to share my screen. You can't talk about visual history and visual exhibits without showing visuals. I just wanted to take a moment to thank all the teachers who are with us today and those who will watch later at a recorded time. As someone intimately involved in the reopening of my university in a couple of weeks, I know the stress that is the month of August 2020. So I appreciate your work on behalf of your students, on behalf of your schools, and certainly on behalf of NHD. So I just wanted to start off with that. Thank you. Apologies for my voice. I'll speak through it. It's just the result of 25 Zoom meetings a week and a lot of presentations. So I'm happy to be here today. I think we're a fairly small crew at the moment. So don't hesitate to pop things in the Q&A, or if you want me to stop it at any time to do something differently or to explain something differently. This is solely for you. So if you want me to cover something else or talk about something else, I really want to do what benefits you in your time most. I'll also add that I've judged at the state contest level NHD in Maine for, oh gosh, John, probably the past 7 or 8 years. And so I'm happy to answer questions kind of from a judging perspective too. But I wanted to spend some time this afternoon talking about using visual primary sources with students in NHD and in the classroom, some helpful exhibit prep hints, but really advocating for doing some work with your students prior to the NHD contest prep on understanding the role of visual primary sources and moving away from visuals as illustration. This is a very common thing that I see in my own classes at USM. It's a common thing I see in working with K through 12 students and teachers. It's a common thing in the historical profession that we have to move beyond just picking a picture because it illustrates a point. That's important and helpful, but you also want to think of choosing the picture as the source that's also communicating the information with your interpretation. And I think that's one of the real hurdles that students have to really work on and overcome in these NHD projects. And so the way for them to get better at that is to spend more time on visual primary source exercises in the classroom. And so I'm going to go through a couple of these primary source exercises that might be of use to you. I'll talk a little bit about the visual research process, and I will certainly spend a little bit of time on thinking through exhibit design, and then also sharing some great NHD sources from other places around that you can kind of have and follow up on as you're working with students. But the visual exhibit, which I think are one of the oldest formats for NHD presentations, and certainly perennially one of the most popular, both individual and group, junior and senior level. I would also say that they have the largest variety that we usually see when judging NHD in Maine, and I'm sure that's true elsewhere as well. And I would absolutely advocate, if you have the ability to do so in your own school, if you have people who are graphic designers, if you have a trusted art teacher, if you have someone who's doing computer design, right? If you have colleagues working in these areas that are more about design, absolutely invite them to come and do sessions with your students. Because so much of putting together the visual exhibit is your ability to tell a visual narrative. And so exposing students to other visual narratives, online exhibits are great, physical exhibits are terrific, but it's COVID-19, so online exhibits are great. Photo essays, The Atlantic has a great occasional blog that just tells stories through pictures. The New York Times Lens blog tells stories through pictures. Certainly looking at Instagram accounts that you might have students follow that are telling narratives through imagery, and I can talk about a few of those. That's really helpful because the more they get the hang of storytelling with images as the primary source, the better they're going to be at setting up an exhibit. And certainly as a visual historian, That's where most of my teaching lies. And even for my college students, it's a lot of work. I'm teaching Photographing American History this fall, and the first 2 weeks of the class are going to be about basic visual theory, reading images, using images, and really doing a deep dive into that. So we'll do a little bit of that work together today. As John mentioned, I'm the executive director of the Osher Map Library and Smith Center for Cartographic Education on USM's Portland campus. This is my lovely closed to the public library that you see in front of you, this beautiful silver building with Buckminster Fuller's world map design on the side. In normal non-COVID times, we see about 5,000 K through 12 students a year, both in field trips who come to us and in site visits we make to classrooms. We see about 100 university classes per year, as well as we have a large public research and gallery exhibit schedule. So the digital pivot has been one that we're really well prepared for, and I'll talk to you about why in a second. But I do relish the time when all of you can come back and visit us. We will open to the campus community on August 31st and to the public by appointment only for limited research and gallery visits on September 10th. So that's sort of where we are right now. We do 2 gallery exhibits a year. We turn all gallery exhibits into digital exhibits. I will show you that on our website in a second. This is our reference room. So this is where we host classes this is where we lay out rare materials. This is where people come in and do research. We also have a classroom that's really a multifunctional space where we also welcome students. And so when we see K through 12 students, sometimes 80 of them at a time, they're split up between the classroom, the reference room, the globe collection, whatever exhibit is going on at the time. So we're really trying to engage them in a lot of high impact activities and kind of changing their activities fairly frequently for the duration of their visit. More relevant in our current time period is our website. And this is no matter where you are in New England. So we are at oshermaps.org. We have about 500,000 maps and related items, globes, atlases, ephemera, posters, you name it, dating back to 1475 in our collection. And over 75,000 of these items are fully digitized and available online. Really strong in certainly global history in the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, increasingly strong in 19th century US visual culture. And we collect modern maps as well, and we buy around curriculum. So we're currently incorporating a lot more maps made by women, made by people of color. We're doing a lot of anti-racist work. We're continuing a lot of work with tribal historians in Maine and just telling different stories with maps, particularly about sovereignty and dispossession of lands is really important to us. On our website, there's a whole section called Teach. You will find literally dozens of free activities for remote learning that students can do in your classroom remotely that you can incorporate into social studies curriculum, into geography, and all kinds of things. And what's interesting is that we usually only see classes from Maine and occasionally New Hampshire for field trips, but our interactive and virtual and synchronous field trips for 2020, 2021 doesn't matter where you are. So if you would like to participate in those, I would definitely encourage you to contact our K through 12 Education Outreach Coordinator, Renee Coyle, to schedule an opportunity for your class. And I will spend some time just showing you a few things on the website towards the end if we have a minute. But I highly encourage you to check it out. And all the maps are downloadable, so you can drop them right into PowerPoint presentations. And when you view them in full screen, they work beautifully on Zoom or Google Hangouts with students. And we digitize at 100 megapixels. So when you're viewing them on screen, you can do a super deep dive with students. And I'll model that towards the end. So have fun playing on there. John mentioned I'm a visual historian by trade and training. My current project is Signs of the Times, where we're documenting COVID-19 signs in Southern Maine and beyond. We're part of any number of community archives in New England that are doing this kind of work. This is a personal project for me, not a map library project. And we have about 300 signs from all over Southern Maine, which we geo-reference. Because one of the things that I know, and certainly that will be important in the NHD theme about communicating this year, the signs are the things that are so ephemeral. They change, they go away. Try finding signs from the 1918, 1919 flu pandemic. It's really hard. And so I wanted to document images of changing signs, marquees, billboards, all the homemade signs that people are putting outside their houses, and really capture that transition between phases of our states reopening and pulling back and reopening again. So it's been a really interesting time to do that. Also really useful in trying to think about how people are communicating their feelings right now. Signs are certainly one of those ways of expressing them. Just some basic visual theory and thinking about, you know, people who you might read or might encounter as you think about your own visual work, is that the relation between what we see and what we know is never really settled. Each evening we see the sunset, we know the earth is turning away from it, yet the knowledge and the explanation never quite fits the sight, right? It's hard to explain some of these things. And John Berger, in his classic Ways of Seeing, which is also a great BBC documentary from the 70s that you can watch on YouTube, students love it. It's very funny, but also very relevant still. Reminds us that seeing comes before words, that the child looks and recognizes before it can speak. And so that development of sight and of visualization is really central and formative. Chuck Close is a contemporary artist of some renown. He wrote this really interesting book called Facebook, probably almost a decade ago. And it's like one of those funny matchbooks for kids where you turn the middle, turn the top, and his faces all change. And I'm really struck at his own reflections on his K-12 education. And I constantly remind teachers and myself of this too, is that he says, there were teachers and mentors all along the way who believed in me. In grade school, I couldn't remember names and dates in history class. So instead, I made a 10-foot-long illustrated map of Lewis and Clark's expedition. I put it up on the wall, and the teacher realized that I wasn't goofing off, but was, in fact, interested in the material and gave me extra credit to make up for my performance on tests and papers. Art was what I did to convince others that I was interested in school. It was what I did to feel good about myself. And one of the things I love so much about working with NHD is seeing the alternative forms of expression for students and how many there are available. You know, if you're media savvy and you want to do a website or a documentary film or a performance, or you're really solid at research papers, or you're visual and you really want to make something, these kind of projects are what we should be bringing into the classroom anyways, to allow for those alternate forms of expression. One of the things I tell my students all the time, particularly as a public historian working in 2020, I mean, I've written books, but they're not the best way to get my work out there and communicate it to a larger audience. What am I doing on Instagram? What am I doing for the public? What am I doing in public presentations? How am I thinking about these alternative forms, you know, like a photo essay and things like that? And I think helping students to work through some of that will make students who are not necessarily interested in history, they will become more engaged because they're more interested in the type of project that they're doing. And exhibits are really great for engaging groups of students who have different skills. You know, someone who's really strong in research, someone who's good with their hands, someone who needs to move around and make things, right? Someone who's a good project manager. The team aspect of it can be really great. I remind myself and my students and people I work with all the time, you know, we live in this visual world, but we're used to looking incredibly fast. You know, I always use the example of the scroll, right? If I pick up my phone and I start looking at something, I'm scrolling, I'm looking down, the size of my screen is very small. I may stop on something to, as my 8-year-old says, like put a heart on it, on Instagram or Facebook or something like that. But am I really looking at it? And so one of the biggest retrainings I have to do with students and teaching visuals is to learn to slow down and to give them many, many opportunities to practice doing that. One of my favorite comments that I got on a teaching evaluation for this Photographing American History course that I teach was from a student who emailed me and was like, "You have ruined the newspaper and print media for me. It takes me so much longer to go through it because now I stop and read all the pictures and not just the text." And that's what, my own pedagogy is a mess right now because I'm a completely site-based, field trip, outside-oriented, archival, picking up objects teacher. And so the challenge for me really is right now how to mimic those experiences in a remote environment. And practicing with these visuals is a big part of that. So I recommend working to develop visual literacy with your students, and that's kind of threefold: the ability to understand, create, and use visual images. All of these play a part in the development of the exhibit, right? You have to understand visual images in order to be able to use them to create something. If you're just seeing them as a way to illustrate a larger topic, you're not understanding the image itself, and it will define the way you use it. I won't spend a particularly long period of time on this, but I would say, as librarians at the college level think about visual literacy, they're looking at all kinds of things, and this is all relevant to what you're doing in making an exhibit, right? Defining your image need, finding the images, interpreting and analyzing them, evaluating them, using the effectively, and creating visual media, and using images ethically, and citing visuals. All 7 of these visual literacy bubbles play into exhibit creation. Defining that need. What do you need to tell this story? Finding the images, interpreting them, and I think using them effectively for impact, for communication, for the purpose of your project. The design choices that you're going to make, the graphic representations that you're going to do, and really citing the images. I would say as a judge, it's one of the things that people do not tend to do as good of a job citing their visuals in projects than in other NHD formats. It's a constant issue, and certainly one we give a lot of feedback for students before they head on to nationals if they're one of the finalists, as a key thing to fix, and we'll talk a little bit about that moving forward. But it's not just sort of, I'm going to do a visual image, I've got to find a bunch of images on my topic, and I'm going to put them together. You got to find them, but then you got to interpret, analyze, and evaluate them, and then you're going to use them and develop your project. So it's really a multi-step process for that. And I always just remind folks, when we're looking, we don't all see the same things. I know it sounds like a silly thing to say, but perception is really central here. Very young children see objects and shapes, then they start to discern concepts and relationships from images. You can think about early board books and picture books that are so central to child development, but also think about the visual message that's being communicated to you, the viewer, but it's going to be transmitted through the lenses of your age, your gender, your race, your past experiences, your culture, your socioeconomics, your mood that day, your religion, your sexual orientation. There are all kinds of things that impact how we receive an image and how we react to it. And certainly images change in that meaning over time, even if the image itself is fixed. You looking at something in 2020, it may not have the same meaning for the person who saw it upon its creation in 1963. And that's one of the hardest pieces to really get across to students. How do we shed this visual baggage? You know, how do we separate looking at something objectively for subjective? How do we address our own biases when looking at images, when choosing images, particularly to make a visual argument? One of the most popular strategies for working with visuals in the K through 12 classroom is a technique called VTS, which is visual thinking strategies. Some of you may have used it. Museums teach it a lot. Museums use the technique a lot when you go on field trips to places like the Museum of Fine Arts Boston or the Portland Museum of Art or, you know, Mystic Seaport in Connecticut. You're going to see people use this as a technique to interact with students. You can get a lot of training on this. There are major workshops on it, but at its very core, visual thinking strategy is only 3 questions that you ask to students in this order. What's going on in this picture? What do you see that makes you say that? And what else can you find? You're not trying to get them to say like, oh, this is Ellis Island in 1914, and you're seeing a line as people who are immigrating to the country come in and get processed and get tested. You know, that's not the end goal. The end goal is practicing looking and observing. If students can't freely observe and tell you what they see, right, and really dig into that and then find the evidence in the picture, then you're going to have a hard time using visual primary sources and getting them to use them in projects. And it also encourages people. One of the things I like so much about VTS, we use it in the map library a lot with classes, is that what else can you find? What more can you find, right? Encouraging, not just dismissing the source after you're done or everybody said something, but what else can you find? Looking again. And I don't care if you're working with 5 students or 30. This is like a free-flowing, sure, you can have hand raising, but the idea is also to get students comfortable talking about sources in a low-stakes environment. So starting with these as warm-up exercises in class, they're great for remote teaching. Like, this is something that actually translates really well online, either in like a typed discussion format. There's a wonderful, I don't know if I would call it an app, but there's a wonderful teaching tool called VoiceThread that you can get a free account to, and actually you can upload images into it, and you can share the link with students, and they can have a conversation about the image remotely by speaking, by sharing another image, by typing it themselves. It's really neat. It's good to look at. But it's this low stakes activity. What's going on? What do you see that makes you say that? What else can you find? Not looking for a right answer, but looking to get a diverse group of students comfortable with sharing what they see. And inevitably, people are like, wait, I didn't see that. What are you talking about? How, you know, it really is a free-flowing, cool activity. So think about starting each class with a VTS warm-up. The more the students do it, the better they get. Kindergartners can do this. It's an increasingly common technique in nursing schools and medical schools as they're trying to teach close observation of patients and not just jumping to conclusions about diagnoses. But having a picture up from whatever time period you're studying, it can be a photograph, I'll show you in a second, it can be a map, and just going through the questions. What's going on in this picture? What do you see that makes you say that? What more can we find? And people will start noticing, oh, I see a girl, you know, I see the water, I see houses. Is that window open? Why is that door closed? Does that one not have any windows? It's dirt and grass. Is that the ocean? What's going on? Why is her hand behind her back? Why is her skirt flipped up? All of those things. And one of the ways that I use this in class, after we've gone through the exercise, I'll reveal the caption, right? Because I'm trying to teach history. I will reveal what it actually is. So I'll say, I don't do this until after the exercise because VTS, it's not about getting it right. It's very low stakes. And then I say, you know, this is a Lewis Hine child labor photograph from August 1911 in Eastport, Maine. And his titles are very descriptive because he's really doing social work with a camera. He says, Elsie Shaw, a 6-year-old cartner during the summer, Seacoast Canning Company, Factory Number 2. Her father is the boss of the cutting room in Factory Number 1. He asked me to take some photos of her as he has her do a singing act in vaudeville in the winter, and she's old enough now to go through the audience and sell her own photos. So this totally changes the conversation around this picture, and then I would go back to it and ask people what they think. You know that 100 years ago, a 6-year-old is employed in a sardine factory down the street. What does that mean for child labor? I would certainly use this during the Progressive Era. But I'd let the students get out what they think is going on and then discuss this once they know what's going on. And that before and after reveal can be helpful too. You can do with a map. This is a map from our collections. It's a huge poster. Union Pacific Railway and connecting lines. We would look closely at it. We'd start to make observations. Oh, I see black lines stretching from the middle of the country to the west. There's pictures around the sides. There's a compass down there. There's a title. There's a lot of text. It uses paint. Who are these people? How are the states differentiated? You know, people will spend, I will tell you to give yourself plenty of time for this activity. Don't be surprised if you spend half an hour on one image and students are engaged with the activity the whole time. Once they get into it, they get kind of nuts and they get good at it. And so then I would tell you that this is what this is. It was published in Chicago in 1887. It's a wall map for exclusive use by large stations. So this was a large map that you would find on the wall in a train station as you're moving your way west in the late 1800s. And the vignettes are sites along the routes. And you also have a lot of advertising going on here. And if you look closely, it shows every single stop that the train is making. And they're very ephemeral. Like this thing was stuck to a wall in a train station. We don't know if there's another exact copy of this map anywhere. There are ones like it, but we can't find anyone who has the same one because of that. And what does that mean about the way people are communicating transportation and westward movement in the late 19th century? And what are the implications here? You know, what are the implications for the indigenous populations? What are the implications environmentally, right? Who's moving here? Whose land are they dispossessing, right? And this is, you know, 5 years after the Dawes Act. What does that mean? This is 4 years before Wounded Knee. What's the context here in these places? And so getting people to put the visuals in context is a really important skill that's really helpful in the exhibits themselves. Another exercise that's quicker with students, and certainly you can do this, it takes 2 minutes. You just set a timer, have something on hand. So choose an image, can be a photograph, can be a map, can be a painting, whatever you want. And you're going to give these instructions. So you've got 2 minutes. You're going to look at the whole image, and then either in your head, if you're looking at this together on a screen and you just have a piece of scratch paper below you, or if you were in a physical classroom and you handed out a Xerox copy of the image you want students to look at, so everyone has one at their desk, that you would divide the photo into quadrants, that you get in the habit of looking at things in 4 sections. So look at the whole thing, and then top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right. You can go in any direction you want. But it's to look at these smaller sections. And then the first part of it is to list everything you see in the photograph. Not what's going on, just literally everything you see, every observation you can possibly make. And then you can get into a discussion of who do you think made it, why, what purpose does it serve, and then you can start analyzing it. You can say, all right, you know, we've done this 2-minute exercise, we've shared our observations. now I want you to list 3 conclusions that you can infer from your own observations and the ones that we shared. And it's this practice, right, together, that allows students to be able to do that with images. It also makes them better at reading text. The more I do these exercises with my students, the better their essays are, the better their use of evidence is, because it's the constant practice in a low stakes way that ends up really helping them move forward on that. And you could tailor this in any way. You know, if you were working with students who are putting together one of the exhibits, you could have them do this with like, okay, what are the 5 most important pictures? What do you see? Make sure that they're understanding the narrative that they're trying to put together visually, and that they know what the photographs are trying to do. You can pair and share with this. You can share out after any stage. It can be a group activity, a small activity, or something you do as a whole class. But this is a quicker one than VTS. And so here's an example of, you know, one that, you know, you could take 2 minutes to do, dividing it in the 4 on your screen, and then really that close looking. So you would see, you know, girl, dog, boys, barefoot, wheel, wagon, hay, barn, roof, tree, smoke. There's a cemetery over on the side. There's electrical poles over on the side. I've looked at this picture a lot. You know, there's a rake on the side. You know, there's horses. And then you start asking all kinds of questions. So you just try to do list the most things that you can see. And inevitably, I've probably looked at this photo 1,000 times, I kid you not. Anytime I do this exercise with someone with this particular photo, someone points out something I never saw before. Every time. That collective image looking is really useful in your own analysis too, and it certainly has helped my own work quite a bit. And so a lot of art museums have a lot of techniques for doing this work with students, but the Nasher Art Museum at Duke, this is really what we're trying to get students to do. Look long, look close, look again, look critically, look thoughtfully. So it's not just look. There's sort of 6, 8, 20 different ways of looking, but spending time, getting into the details, going back and looking at something again with a critical eye, with a thoughtful lens. It really helps their ability to be able to make these exhibits and things like that. I would say that if you're someone who likes to use infographics in class, as people do more and more, that these close-looking strategies are especially important with more complex infographics that include multiple visuals and text. This is just an example for our collections. It's something we recently bought. Spotlight on the 1968 elections. This was actually made for classrooms. It's from the Civic Education Service. There is so much information on this. If you really wanted to read this and digest it and you could see how the quadrants would be helpful here. There are photographs, there are printed artworks, there are charts, there are tables, there's numbers on the map itself. You've got to be able to interpret the color, looking at the lineup. You can see that a teacher on the bottom of this map wrote powers of the presidents, powers of the president in there, looking at political symbols, looking at the changing political scene. And so I encourage you, if you're using this type of stuff for illustration or teaching in your own work, to give people the time that they really need to digest this. And what questions a student might ask when looking at this. Is an interesting graphic, you know, that says where citizens under 21 vote. Most of them know that at this point the voting age is 18, but did they understand when it changed? So, you know, now some of your high school seniors can vote. So what does that mean? And what did 1968 have to do with that change, which comes, you know, really as a result of Vietnam and so many young men and women going over to Southeast Asia to fight in this war without the ability to vote or have any policy decisions. And so there's a real push after the war for that. And so these infographics and really unpacking them lead to a lot of conversations. How are candidates for the presidency visualized now and then? Is the White House still organized this way? Is there still a movie theater? Is there still a swimming pool and a gym? Why is this important to point out on like a civic education map? I don't know. But something to think about as you're working with infographics. Advertisements are great visuals to work with students. Duke has a wonderful digitized repository called Ad Access, where they really emphasize on ads from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. It allows students to compare advertising over time. There's a ton you can do with gender in these advertisements, especially if you're teaching 1920s and the new woman, especially if you're teaching transitions from like Victorian mentalities, generational differences, and also showing the roots of like the multi-billion-dollar beauty industry that really take hold in the 1920s, and thinking about why. And you can look at depictions of race in ads. And so students can do a lot with this, but advertisements are great visuals that people don't always think about for putting on NHD visual projects either. So questions, to think about with your students, with yourself, as you're working on your own visual literacy, which is a constant work in progress, for me too. Do the images illustrate or do they tell the story? I mean, I think that's a key question for students to be asking with this exhibit as they're setting it up. What is the role of these images on this very visual narrative? Are they just illustrating your text, or are they helping to tell the story? How does the text inform someone's visual understanding? At the end of the day, an NHD visual exhibit has to stand alone in judgment. The whole narrative has to be there. Sure, we interview students. Sure, we have the process paper. But at the end of the day, it has to stand alone. So how are the text and the visuals working together? How are they informing? Do images inform the text? Do text inform the visuals? And how intimately are those connected? I think that's important. And I would say this is one good example. And it was funny, I picked this before I read the 2021 guide. And there's a whole thing on this image in the 2021 guide. And this is one where I'd have students do that observation, maybe some VTS. We'd look at the painting, wouldn't tell them what it is. Then I would give them the caption and the date, John Gast's American Progress from 1872. Then I would show them how it was first published. And then after I got them to do a full observation, analysis, drawing conclusion, what does American Progress mean in 1872? Who are the beneficiaries? Who's losing out on this? Why? I mean, they see so much. And I'll have to tell you, I did this with a bunch of teachers and older students, and someone had brought their kid, their 4-year-old, to the training, and we were looking at this exhibit, and everyone was shouting out what they see. And the 4-year-old was like, she has a star on her head. No one else in the room had seen that. Right? So there's a lot being communicated here that has a lot to do when I teach 19th century US history. This is how I start the course, is with this image. And if this purports to tell the story of the 19th century, what narratives are left out and what are included. And what's interesting is that there's a key to this, because this was a marketed image to sell so people could hang it in their house. And the explanatory text was used to market it. So you can actually look in 1872, the instructions for interpreting this image. Students can see how close they were. They can analyze the language and align with the visual. But the language is terrible. I mean, so if you're looking at expanding knowledge of land dispossession, if you're getting away from this grand narrative of manifest destiny, if you're looking to complicate your students' understanding of the past, these images really help with that, and they can be paired with other images that tell a very different story. And so this beautiful, charming female, the star of empire, indicative of civilization, darkness, waste, and confusion. Fleeing from progress are Indians, buffaloes, wild horses, bears, and other game, moving westward, ever westward. And so you can see, there are racial slurs used in this, but this isn't some hidden text. This is in like every westward guide that people are taking across country with them. It's advertised in railroad stations. It's advertised on trains, that this is the promotional image of that. So much so that what home, from the miner's humble cabin to the stately marble mansion of the capitalist, should be without this great national picture? Who would not have such a token in their house? And really exploring why that's so incredibly problematic, and what people depicted in this image might offer as an image of American progress in 1872 instead. And this narrative of fleeing and erasure is so common in 1870s United States materials, because they want people to think that the tribes are no longer in these spaces. Of course they are. So it's part of that calculated erasure that you can tie into a whole lot of other things. But it's a rich image, and then having the text is important to get students to unpack as well. Having discussions about how we interpret something now, how it might have been interpreted when the image was created, how we can shed our 21st century baggage even momentarily, how that interpretation changes over time, how people co-opt images to make their point, just like they do textual quotes out of context, where they can see evidence of that, how people manipulate images, how this translates into the type of images they see today on Instagram, on TikTok, whatever it is that they're using, Snapchat. So even really young students can do this. When I teach third graders in Portland, the history of Portland, I show them an image like this, and I say, what can you tell me about the city of Portland from looking at this print? And they can do a lot, right? Maybe it's not the most complex narrative being produced, but they have to be asked to interpret it. What do you see, right? You could easily do VTS with that. And so it's getting students in the habit of doing this with all of the images that they're researching and looking at for their projects. But they can't just do it with their projects. It has to be more incorporated to their daily way of being, or it's not going to stick. Prior learning and knowledge inform our perception of new images. My students say all the time, well, of course you can interpret this because you know the narrative. And I'm like, well, I didn't always know the narrative. And I still don't know every narrative. So what context do I need to be able to do this? What do I need to be able to read? What other images do I need to pair with this to get a fuller story? And so I would say, I often do things like these images. You can show, many Americans images that look like this and say, what are these from? And people will say, oh, these are from the Great Depression. How do they know? How do they intuitively know that these images are from the Great Depression? They're published a lot. You see them in school. But it's this documentary 1930s vibe, as if the entire world is in black and white. But that's not how people lived in the past, right? We live in color. And so if you imagine the 1930s, even in your head, as black and white and looking like this, what changes when you can then turn around and say, oh, the Farm Security Administration also took pictures in color. And they're totally different. They give a completely different vibe. This is actually Quincy in Mass. Does the use of color change your perception of these decades? Why? How? How would students respond to this? How do you choose what you're including in your image, in your exhibit? Where do you use color? Where do you use black and white? Is it access to resources, or is it what you're trying to convey visually? And I would also say just a quick note about neatness, although if you saw my actual office beyond the Zoom, you should tell me that I have no judgment on other people's neatness. But when you're presenting something visually, one of the things that I always want to tell students is, look at the presentation. I see so many images that people throw on these boards that are like wonkily cut or like crooked. And I think telling them the importance of the presentation, even though it's homemade, and it should look like kids made it. That's the other thing. Like, it should look like they made it because they should make it. But just emphasizing things like, maybe take a few extra minutes to put a line down this thing with some scissors before you cut it out can make all the difference in how seriously the viewer takes their narrative, right? And what they're drawn to and what they're attracted to in this way. So as I wrap up and we turn to Q&A and having a discussion with some of these things, and I'll share a few resources about exhibit design too. I really like this quote from Joshua Brown, particularly at the bottom, that historians must be willing to treat photographs and other archival visual evidence with the same seriousness and rigor they apply to text. Until they recognize photographs as a legitimate resource, the value of historical inquiry will never be adequately tested or fully realized. And I think that's true, and I think it starts in the classroom. It starts in the K through 12 classroom, it continues in the collegiate classroom, as taking these seriously, as pieces of evidence that students need to be taught how to look at. And be like, oh, I know how to look at pictures, I look at them 5 million times a day. But do you? To what extent are you really looking at them? And what does it mean when you actually stop and start looking at some of these things in more detail? So reading these images, these photographs, these maps, these other visuals, we just have to move beyond illustration. And I think this work, right? And you're like, oh, I thought I signed up to take a webinar on making a cool exhibit. Without this work, the training around visual literacy, and it's hard to do, because expecting students to have the knowledge and the background to select these images, to really analyze and interpret them without practice doing it is very difficult, and I think sets them up for more challenges. And so incorporating these little exercises as often as you can are really helpful. This is just from the NHD categories page about the visual exhibits. It's a visual representation of your research. And that's the first sentence. And I think that's significant. And your topic's significance in history. It has to be, the analysis and interpretation of your topic must be clear. Labels and captions should be used creatively with visual images and objects to enhance the message. So it is the text and the image working in concert to tell this narrative. Because students who have chosen to do this have chosen to do a visual representation of their research and analysis. And that's what that board, built thing, piece of poster board, trifold, whatever it is they use. And so as they're thinking about this, I really would urge students to think about the format and to storyboard, right? Sketch out their exhibits, sketch out how they're going to lay things out, practice laying things out before they glue things down. They can do this on a sketch pad, they can do it with a pen and paper, they could do this, they're so skilled at just hopping on Google Slides. They could do this on a shared Google Doc, G Suite, or whatever you might use. They can collaborate on sketching this out, on drafting this visually, just like you would draft text, right? And so you're drafting the visual narrative, and you're also drafting the text that goes along with it. And initially, those might be two separate drafts. that come together and get mocked up. Oh, what if we move this here? Is this really telling the story? And so in selecting the items, editing, is so hard. If you have a local newspaper where they do a lot of visuals, you might ask like the arts editor to come talk to the students. A photographer might submit 35 images to cover one event, and the editor might only be able to pick 2. And talking through that process with students of winnowing can be really helpful. What serves your purpose? What doesn't? And these questions that NHD put out are really significant, because that question about, does the item advance the story you're trying to tell? Is it easy to read and understand? Does it take up too much space? What are the images that best tell your story? Not what are the images that best illustrate your story? What are the best images that tell your story? And I would practice with students putting the images up without the captions and the text, having classmates look at it and say, what's the visual story here? See if they can figure it out, how close they get. They should be able to get decently close. The text is only going to enhance that. And so I think giving that some thought is significant. And a last note on research and thinking about this. It's a great theme this year. Communication and history, the key to understanding. I would ask students, all students who are doing these projects, I would ask them to practice visualizing the theme. So sharing this with them and say, okay, how do we visualize communication? I did this myself, yesterday. Well, we can visualize communication by visualizing actual instruments of communication. It's pretty literal. Library of Congress, prints and photographs, online catalog is a time-honored go-to for me. I would send students there first to find images. Well, this is a map from our collections, actually the first map I ever bought as executive director. It doesn't look communicative when you just look at it at first glance, but this is a map that actually maps out how many weekly and daily newspapers each county in New England has, and the major industries of each area, and it's aimed at advertisers. So you can tailor your advertising to the major industries in the area. How do postcards communicate? How do postcards communicate a message, and also how are they an important vehicle of communication? Letters, postcards, how are people corresponding? How are people communicating throughout the past? Posters, propaganda as a means of communication. The WPA poster collection, digitized at the Library of Congress, is like an endless source for excellent visuals from the 30s and 40s, often produced by the Federal Writers Project, Theater Project, Federal Arts Project, etc. This is a dated events war map from 1942. This was meant to communicate the events of World War II for people on the home front, that you could add the events down the bottom as you understood this, to connect people to where their loved ones were and to allow them to follow the news. Signs, protests, especially right now, right? How are these signs a way of communicating? I chose this film still in particular, not just for the signs, but also because of the inclusion of the press truck, like really showing how the event is being documented in real time. So these guys up here are taking a picture, someone's rolling a video camera, they clearly see this is going on. And so what does the story that they communicate about this event differ from this guy over on the right that's taking notes, like an embedded reporter with his camera in his hand who's walking, versus a participant? And thinking about that, there's so much going on in this image of the March on Washington. But certainly protest signs seem significant to me right now. I'll stop sharing for just a second. I'm gonna send, I'm gonna share again just so I can show you this document that I will make sure that people have access to. This is something that the NHD Wisconsin put together on National History Day exhibits, and thinking about how they are and taking a closer look at them. They're great. I think many of these local organizations who are with us today probably have their own versions of this that they're happy to share. But one of the things that I think was really important in terms of the message that's on here, and this is a document that students can follow. It's the type of thing I'd have out while I was putting something together. But this content is more important than glitz. I can't tell you how many conversations we have as judges about this, where you can see the glitziest, fanciest, there's like 3 sounds playing, something spinning. It's very neat. But like, if it doesn't have the content and the context, and if it doesn't tell the story, it's not going to win on glitz alone. In fact, that's a small part of it. So having students really take the time to think about that, right? And to really plan things out is significant. But I'm going to stop here and open it up to questions and comments and anything anyone wants to talk about.
Thank you, Libby. It was very informative and very interesting. I had a few thoughts myself as you were going through the presentation. First is this morning when we were talking with Madison Albert from Greeley Middle School, who I believe you judged with this past.
Sure, yeah, she was great.
She was talking about her process in putting together projects, or her exhibits when she was doing them. And one of the things that she mentioned too was sketching it out. She literally would get out a piece of paper and sketch out the different ways that she might lay out that exhibit. And then she would move on from that to then actually using felt and Velcro and moving stuff around, on a board, and then finally coming down with the glued out part of it. So there is a lot of effort that goes into trying to storyboard something like that out. So I'm glad that you reinforced that.
And I often share with people, and I'll open the Q&A up now because I can see it. The storyboarding or the mock-up is really important, but I'll share with you, in my own academic life, which I no longer have anymore as an administrator, but I still teach. But in my own research, any project I start, any presentation I put together, my process starts with visuals, which is very, which is not everybody starts that way. And I think that it's significant to share that with students. Like before I write any text, I literally formulate my arguments by gathering visuals and moving them around. And then I start writing. It doesn't work for everybody, and there's no one process that works for everybody. It's really important when you're teaching research to students. Certainly there are common elements, but like Susie, Johnny, and Jake, like you all have to use index cards and then do this. Like have a method, but the methods don't have to be the same. They don't work for everybody. But for me, the visual one really works and has consistently over time. But I think in projects like this, when I chose my topic, the first thing I'm going to do is like explore that topic through the imagery, and then I'm going to read. And that's a perfectly valid way to do it.
Yeah, I think it is. And actually, that actually leads to my second point that I was thinking about while you were giving your presentation, which is that the VTS, I know we're talking about exhibits in general today, and that's our focus, but I really think VTS can really work out with all the categories and really help all the students in all of those categories, especially docs and websites, of course, because they have to use visuals in their projects, but even in performance. So by looking at using VTS and seeing how things can be interpreted, that can influence of how students will use their props or what props they will use, how they'll design their set or their costumes, and then even in papers, because I'm a paper judge at the national contest, and so we always have appendices, and one of our biggest pet peeves is, why did you use this image? Why did you put this image in an appendix? We don't see how this fits, and so being able to really come down and have them look at those sources, even paper students look at those sources to better understand whether or not it's a useful source or not to include.
It took me a long time, certainly through grad school, to truly realize that the way I see images and interpret them is quite different from the way others see them. So I would, write about these images, or I would include them, and my professors would be like, why? And then it was essentially likened to like, wait, don't you just see what's going on? Okay, obviously you don't see what's going on because I see this differently than you. So someone one day to me likening it to showing your work in math was really a significant hurdle in the sense of like, oh, okay, I need to actually walk you through my observations, my interpretation and analysis, and my conclusion of this image. Because when you look at this, you're not seeing what I look at. And that the only thing that fixes that is practice. And you do see like continued improvement with students in this kind of work over time. I taught a Maine history of art in Maine for the bicentennial last spring, half in person, half remote. And I would say one of the, challenges for my students, I had them write a page about an image of their choice related to the week's theme almost every week. And they were like, but by the end, they were like, wow, we're so much better at this. I'm like, yeah, and your papers are better and your final project is better. And everything's better because you're getting that balance of how do I communicate my observations about a visual image, and then how do I add historical context and analysis? And I'm still working on that myself. Work in progress.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any comments, or is there any comments in the question, or any questions?
Libby, I have to say, first of all, I thoroughly enjoyed this presentation. This was wonderful. I was personally very excited to see you bringing up VTS because I love it as well. And I love the way that you contextualized using it to think almost like as a visuals forward way of drafting your argument, right? Which is not the way that I approach, and was really wonderful to think about. For folks who have never used VTS, and I see one person in the comments who's really excited by it, Cindy had that great comment. The other thing I like about VTS is that if you work with it, you're also using kind of facilitator tools to connect the students' observations. So it's helping them think about, how do I support an argument, right? What do you see that makes you say that? Which is really fun to hear from teachers how it carries over into like their writing as well, which is fun. Just wanted to throw that out there.
Oh, thanks. It's been, and everybody will use it differently. Well, you won't when you first learn it. You'll use it how they train you to use it, but then you'll adapt it to your purposes, and you will see, like in this exercise, because everyone has to say something and it's comfortable for people to say something because it's low stakes, you'll get a lot of the silent people in your class to speak up a little bit, and you'll be surprised how observant some students are that you might not otherwise think are observant. It's a lot of fun. 6 feet apart in masks.
Couldn't agree more. Having a facilitator background, I was smiling ear to ear on the open-ended questions on the visual.
Libby, I had a question. I know we talked about this a little bit this morning with the student Q&A, but you mentioned you love the Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Division, and that's kind of a good place to start. I think this year, especially because a lot of libraries and archives won't be open, students will have to find sources online. Do you have other suggestions of good starting places, at least, to find visuals?
Oh, sure. If you want maps, come to me. No, OsherMaps.org has tons of maps. But no, I would say, depending on the type of visuals, there are so many archives out there. Barring a government shutdown. I will tell you that when you assign your students to do a lot of work on the Library of Congress and the government decides to shut down for 3 weeks, your assignments get ruined sometimes. Have definitely run into that. But no, Library of Congress prints and photographs, but also Library of Congress has a wonderful maps website. I would say that the New York Public Library has unbelievable digitized collections. That's an excellent place to start, hundreds of thousands. And I would say the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in particular, a couple of years ago, made as many of their visuals as possible open source. It's pretty amazing, like tens and tens of thousands that you no longer have to seek publication permission for, that you no longer have to, you can just use them. I mean, obviously you cite where they come from, right? But you can use them and you can download full, beautiful images. That's why I encourage those sites, because of the quality of the image you can use, print and use on your, you know, on your board. We see a lot of pixelated things when students blow them up too big, but also some really tiny things because they can't, and then you can't see it. So gravitating towards these, you know, online repositories like Library of Congress, like New York Public Library, like the Met, and certainly locally, I mean, the Boston Public Library has some great visual collections, both on Flickr and on their site. And the Digital Commonwealth for people in Massachusetts has wonderful visuals from around the state. In Maine, the Maine Memory Network is a trusted partner. There are some watermark issues sometimes on some of their images, but usually you can get around that for educational. I personally gravitate towards places where you can download images without the watermarks on them, because you're going to cite the sources. And I think you're going to see a lot more libraries moving in that direction. Sometimes, depending where you are, local archives are terrific. I mean, for instance, the Penobscot Marine Museum in Searsport, Maine, has 150,000 photos in their collection, and thousands are fully digitized. Labor, shipping, I mean, it's really an incredible collection. So those local gems in your own region are also important, but the tried and true, I mean, I start at the Library of Congress and then work my way out. The nice thing about the Met, and also about a lot of map collections, David Rumsey map collection at Stanford has beautiful digitals. The Leventhal at Boston Public Library does too. They're global in scope. So we know kids aren't just working on topics about the United States. And so the art museums really help with that too. I mean, they have massive global collections that really allow you to use those visuals. And if your students have language skills, like increasingly, you know, the Bibliothèque Nationale in France, the BNF, has huge digital collections, as does the British Museum. So I would send them far afield, but I have tried and true trusted places, and those are some of them. I see another question from Christine in the chat about how do you advise students to balance their presentations, visuals versus words? Well, one of the I think both nice things and challenging things about putting together an NHD exhibit, and this is where the rule book comes in so handy, is that the advice is often the rules, because they can only have, and John, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but they can only have 500 words of their own written text on a visual exhibit, right? Which we all know isn't a lot. But when you're using captions and URLs and things, that doesn't count towards their word count. So the balance of that is that if this is a visual exhibit, that when I'm walking up to it, you want to be visually welcomed in. So you want to think about the strategic placement of the images, the way the narrative is being told, if it's a trifold. Often people have the title in the center. The thesis is a big part of what they have to have on there, and that text, a lot of text goes there. But one of the things that I would advise, Christine, and that I see a lot of imbalance, is taking more time strategically on image captions. And I'm not saying taking more words, but taking a short sentence to really explain why you used something. Even something as simple as like, this depicts the way telephone lines were used in 19th century Indiana. You know, it doesn't often need to be more than that, but it is an acknowledgement of like, I chose this for a reason, and here is this narrative. So I think, Christine, on a visual exhibit, you want to privilege the visuals a bit, but it has to work in concert with the text. And that text has to be, you know, I think of it like a museum exhibit, and you can walk students through this too, where you have, you know, like an intro panel that might be served by their thesis that you would encounter at the beginning of an exhibit. And then you might have section headers, right? Dividing different parts of the exhibit and visually bringing people around with you. And then you might have, you know, little tiny captions. Oh, well, caption thoughtfully. But caption. Don't avoid caption just because you don't want to spend the words. I think that's where a lot of people fall down on this. But certainly in putting the presentations together, I would spend a lot of time finding impactful visuals that can tell your narrative alongside the text and privilege the visuals. But if you don't have text that matches it or helps you along, it's not gonna fly either. It's a delicate balance. But also you don't, I think sometimes kids say, oh, visuals, I need to throw 50 images on this poster board, and you don't. Like, graphically edit, 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 edit. What are the most important ones that tell your story? I'm not up on all the rule changes for 2021.
Yeah, sorry, Libby. The new rule book just came out a few weeks ago.
I'll absorb that in April when I judge.
Yes, that's right.
I think it's such a great point, though, that it's making the visual part of the argument. And if you're going to do that, then you have to devote a bit of text to saying why it's there. That's such a great point.
And so few students do. I mean, that's often my biggest comment in judging. Is like, amazing photo. Why is it there? Oh, Cindy, that's a great question. I was actually giving some thought to that yesterday. This is gonna be a terrible answer. It depends on the topic. But it does depend on the topic, because I think showing a range of visuals is really significant in the putting together of these exhibits. But I would also really ask, what purpose does it serve? Like, do I really need a copy of the Declaration of Independence on my John Hancock communication thing? Or are other things more importantly? Like, maybe on his I do. But, you know, if I'm doing a project about communication during World War I, and I'm using something like the Zimmerman telegram, and half my project is about the Zimmerman telegram, you should probably show the visual of it. But if it's something that students are expecting judges to read, then I would think about it carefully and caption accordingly, because a lot of the documents students include are really blurry. But yeah, I mean, if you're writing, if you're making a project about like the Telegraph and you want to show some Western Union, I mean, you should show that. But I wouldn't include a lot of Gov docs as visuals, expecting that a judge reading the whole Gov doc is a way to get around the text limit, because it's really hard to do that. But I also would welcome the inclusion of Gov docs as visuals, because for some topics, they're just absolutely essential to the story. But having a student explain briefly, like, why they would include the document, you know, that can be solved with a very short caption, and as part of their thesis and narrative. But yeah, topic dependent certainly, but sometimes really important. And I would avoid, you know, like 10 Gov docs on an image board. They're very distracting from the impact. And if it's going to be on there, like, have it be clear and appropriately sized. Like a tiny cutout of a Gov doc doesn't usually help much.
I'll add to that, and I'll say that, you know, as someone who used to do a lot of judging on exhibits, sometimes if you would see a Gov doc like that, you would kind of, in the back of your mind, think, well, they're just trying to use up the space. They don't know what else to fill the space with. But at the same time, I'm in agreement with you, Libby. I mean, if you're talking about the CCC and you're using the propaganda posters for the CCC, I mean, those are perfectly acceptable and should definitely be on an exhibit.
And I'll just say, for the purposes of people who are watching this recorded and haven't seen the chat, you probably can tell already, but the question was, how do you advise students when using government documents as visuals in the exhibit? So I think we probably would have gotten there, but just to say it.
Doing another shout out for the new rubric, we now, Libby, have a section on student voice, so students are going to be getting points if they're making their own argument and not doing kind of having so much dependence on things like sticking documents up there to do it for them. So your comments around captioning are probably a really good way to score higher in student voice.
So is student voice also going to be scoring the interview higher? No.
No, so student voice is about particularly having better focus on student argument in the project as opposed to using a ton of secondary sources or sticking up a ton of document quotes to make the argument.
Oh, that's awesome. That's a nice way.
So kind of giving them some good points for that.
I also want to piggyback on one other thing that you mentioned, Libby, which was editing, doing your visual editing. Your visual sources and editing those down. That is a very difficult thing even for adults to do when they're putting exhibits together. As I'm sure you put exhibits together, Libby, I do too. I'm sure when you go to other museums, you'll sometimes critique it, or you'll be working with other people and you will go back and forth on whether or not you need to insert an image or not. And so it's not only difficult for students, but it's even difficult for adults. So that's something that should be remembered as you're working with students.
When I wrote my last photo book, I got to include like 3 photos by Shannon Stanley Emmons. To choose the 3 I included,
Yeah.
I looked at 1,500. I mean, it's really like, people are going to be looking at a massive amount of things to winnow down. And that's really a point where I would encourage students and their advisors and their teachers. When you're in that research and gathering phase, don't be like, oh, found a picture of MLK, I'm good. Look for like 30 pictures of Martin Luther King Jr. In multiple contexts. And then when the photo was taken and how it specifically adds to what you're doing, right? So talking about, and I could use any figure as an example, but if you're really talking about someone's late in life work and it's not about their early life and all the images are from their early life, it doesn't always make sense. You really should be matching the context of the image and the timing of the image to the era you're talking about, unless you're trying to set a scene of context over like change over time in a long form. Sure. If you're doing something on like Indigenous land dispossession, or you were looking at something that you really need to show an arc of change over time, sure, have visuals for all kinds of different eras. But you really do want to match. I would encourage students to do that because I think it's often like an illustration, hunt and find. Like, oh, I need an image of Margaret Chase Smith, John. But, what image do you need of her and for what purpose? And I really would encourage some time spent on that because I do see the evidence on exhibits all the time where like you went on Google image search, which by the way is like a key part of my process and hugely important. But you can tell when a student goes on Google image search and they're like, oh, number 2, found it, cut, paste, as opposed to like really researching deeply images of people and events and places, would definitely be something I see a lot of evidence of and something that people can model while working on this stuff.
So I see that we've got about 6 minutes left, so I want to kind of throw this out into the chat or the Q&A. If we've got any other questions we can pass along to our presenter. This has all been marvelous. Also, I want to take your class very badly.
Well, it's fully online this semester, so you'd be more than welcome to shoot me an email. It will, we take auditors.
I may take you up on
It's
that.
my favorite.
It sounds amazing.
Photographing American history is my favorite class that I teach. It's like picking between my children. I like a lot of classes, but this one has a special place in my heart. Oh, and also we're like totally founding everything and visualizing the dual pandemics of COVID-19 and race and how that traces back over time. So that's where we're going with that.
I see another person saying they want to audit too. We will have to, actually, do you mind if we drop your email in the chat?
Not at all. I'm just typing the title of the class. There are still a couple of spots. And if you audit, you don't have to do the work. You just have to read and participate.
That sounds even better. Put your email address there in the chat.
I like the comment, not having to do the homework is the bonus.
It is. There's no way I could take a class and do the homework right now, but there's one I want to audit that I'm trying to figure out how to do that. But yeah, absolutely. Oh, and the titles of my books.
Yeah.
The most relevant thing that I have written that is maybe of particular interest in another time for teachers is I will drop in the chat. It's called The Lens of the Local, and it's in the history teacher, and it's about like using the landscape to teach the hidden histories of your environment and how you use local history to really get students interested in national and global history as a lens to do that. So the history teacher is an open source journal, which is a lovely thing. So I dropped the link in the chat. And it's been a while since I've written a book. Administration will do that to you. But 1840 to 2015, that's the most recent one. And then the other one is Maine Moderns. I have a book chapter due in like a week that I'm not quite sure how it's going to get written. I hope they're not watching.
And you worked on the Maine Atlas, right? As well. Oh, you did not? Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
I came to maps late in life.
Quick comment, by the way, you mentioned the Norman B. Leventhal Map Center at the Boston Public Library. They sponsor a prize for Massachusetts NHD. They are wonderful and would definitely be up for talking with any students you want to direct their way.
Great education department, fantastic colleagues. We work with them all the time. Can't say enough good things about them.
Well, I'm not seeing any other questions. So I want to thank you again, Libby, for taking the time to speak with us. It was very informative, as always. And I appreciate... What's that?
I said, thanks, everybody.
We appreciate everything you were able to do for us today. So,
my pleasure. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Appreciate your time, too. I know it's precious these last couple of weeks. Although in Maine, they keep delaying the start of K through 12, so it's more than a couple of weeks now.
I do want to mention that tomorrow we are going to be focusing in on documentaries. And so the PBS Rhode Island editors will be in the morning at 10 o'clock. It will be roughly a 90-minute session. There is a link on our agenda. Correct me if I'm wrong, Sam. There's a link on our agenda that we recommend that you watch prior to the session tomorrow. And then tomorrow afternoon, we will have Matthew Gilbert, who was a prize-winning student at the national contest from Maine. And he will be discussing what his strategies and how he put together his documentaries and his experiences with NHD. And there are 2 links to his 2 documentaries that he created as well on the agenda as well. And we recommend that you watch, at least try to watch a little bit of each one of them, because I'm sure he'll be referencing them tomorrow as we talk. Is there anything else that we should mention, Sam or Kate, Alyssa?
No.
Okay. All right, then I guess we will see everybody at 10 a.m. tomorrow. Talk about docs.
Thank you so much, Libby. This was
Thank
really
you.
Thank you so
I'll be on
much.
another.
I may be emailing you soon about that course. So.
Please do. I would love to have you. Be a treat.
Sounds fascinating.
Thank you.